In the suffocating heat of the summer of 1822, Lord Castlereagh, the most powerful man in the British Empire, found himself paralyzed not by the armies of Napoleon or the violent mobs calling for his head, but by a single, terrifying whisper. It was a fear of the crime not to be named, an accusation that carried a fate far worse than political ruin in the 19th century. On August 12th, the man who had redrawn the map of the world stood trembling in his dressing room and, with a tiny penknife barely an inch long, severed his own carotid artery. He didn't die because of the immense pressure of statecraft. He died because he believed he was about to be exposed as a sodomite. Just weeks prior, his peer, the Bishop of Clogher, had been caught in a sordid backroom scandal with a soldier stripped of his dignity and forced to flee the country in disgrace. Castlereagh, watching this lavender scare unfold, became convinced that the same shadow was closing in on him, believing with total certainty that he was the next target of a blackmail conspiracy that would destroy his existence. This fatal desperation was not born from the external hatred of the common people, which Castlereagh had endured for 20 years with an aristocrat's cold detachment. He was a man used to having stones thrown at his carriage and seeing his effigy burned in the streets. He viewed the mob as sheep whose opinions did not concern the shepherd. Instead, he was consumed by a specific gnawing terror of exposure. It was the fear of a crime that, in 1822, was considered more heinous than murder: sodomy. To understand why a prime minister-level statesman would choose to cut his own throat rather than face this accusation, one must strip away the romanticized veneer of the Regency era, the world of Jane Austen novels and elegant tea parties, and look at the brutal reality of a time where the divide between the rich and the poor was a canyon, and where the law regarding male sexuality was medieval and unforgiving. The legal reality was stark. The Buggery Act of 1533 was still the law of the land, classifying same-sex acts as a felony punishable by death. Dozens of men were hanged for it in the early 19th century. While a man of Castlereagh's immense social stature might have escaped the gallows through the corruption of the legal system, perhaps allowed to flee into a shameful exile in Italy or France, he faced a terror far worse than execution: the pillory. For attempted sodomy, the punishment was to be locked in a wooden frame in a public square, head and hands trapped, completely defenseless against the mob. It wasn't just humiliation. It was a state-sanctioned carnival of violence. Crowds would pelt the prisoner with mud, dead animals, offal from slaughterhouses, and jagged stones. Men were frequently blinded or even beaten to death by the flying debris right there in the wooden frame. For Castlereagh, the mere prospect of his name, a name he had spent a lifetime polishing into a symbol of authority, being dragged through this mire was a psychological torture he could not withstand. It was this specific fear that led the savior of Europe to end his life on his dressing room floor. Even if you escaped the pillory, the mere accusation was social death. In the Regency world, reputation was currency. If you were labeled a sodomite, your bank credit vanished. Your friends, even close ones, would cross the street to avoid being seen with you. Your wife would be a pariah. Your political career would be vaporized instantly. There was no coming back. It was a total erasure of the self. This environment created a thriving, vicious industry in London: blackmail. It was organized crime. Gangs of bullies operated in the city. They would identify wealthy, older men who were suspected of having same-sex desires. They would send in bait: young men, often soldiers or laborers, paid to flirt and lure the target into a private room in a tavern or a dark alley. Just as the target was compromised, the gang would burst in. They would claim to be constables. They would threaten immediate arrest, immediate exposure, immediate ruin. Unless, of course, a fee was paid. Castlereagh lived in this world. He knew these stories. He knew men who had disappeared overnight. And in the summer of 1822, the shark tank suddenly got much bloodier, and the spark that finally ignited Castlereagh's paranoia occurred just weeks before his death, when a scandal erupted that shook the British establishment to its foundations. It involved the Bishop of Clogher, Percy Jocelyn. Jocelyn was an Irish aristocrat just like Castlereagh. He was a high-ranking official in the Church of England. He was powerful, wealthy, and seemingly untouchable. Then one night, he was caught in the back room of a pub called the White Lion in London. He was found with his trousers down, in a compromising position with a private soldier of the Grenadier Guards named John Moverley. The witnesses didn't care that he was a bishop. They dragged him out. They beat him. He was arrested. Usually, a man of his rank would be quietly bailed out and allowed to disappear. But this time, the press got hold of it. The details were splashed across the newspapers. The public outrage was nuclear. The bishop was stripped of his position. His family was disgraced, and he was forced to flee to Scotland, living the rest of his life under a fake name, working as a butler. The message to Castlereagh was terrifyingly clear. No one is safe. If a bishop could be destroyed, a foreign secretary could be destroyed. The old rules of aristocratic protection were failing. The mob was watching, the press was watching, and Castlereagh, exhausted, overworked, and mentally fragile, began to believe he was next. We will likely never know the absolute truth of what Castlereagh did or didn't do. Did he actually visit a brothel? Did he actually pick up a soldier? Or was he simply a man with repressed desires who was targeted by a blackmail gang? The rumors that swirled after his death were specific. They said he had been entrapped. The story went that he had been lured to a house thinking he was meeting a woman, or perhaps a young man, and was caught in a setup. He had received letters. "We have the evidence," they said. "We know what you are." Imagine the psychological pressure. This was a man who had spent 20 years holding the fate of nations in his hands. He had negotiated with Napoleon. He had redrawn borders. He had sent armies to die. He had withstood the hatred of millions of his own countrymen. But he could not withstand this. The idea that his name, the name he had spent a lifetime polishing into a symbol of authority, would be dragged through the mud of a sodomy trial was more than he could bear. The marble facade didn't just crack, it pulverized. To understand how he reached this point of total collapse, we have to go back. We have to look at the man before the suicide. We have to look at how Robert Stewart became Lord Castlereagh, and why, long before the blackmailers came for him, half of England already wanted him dead. He was born in Dublin in 1769, and this is the first key to his character. He was Irish. In the complex hierarchy of the British Empire, the Anglo-Irish aristocracy occupied a strange, defensive middle ground. They were the rulers of Ireland, owning the land and controlling the laws, but they were looked down upon by the pure English nobility in London. The English saw them as slightly wild, slightly unrefined, new money. The Stuarts were wealthy, but they were climbers. Castlereagh's father had bought his way up the ladder, purchasing titles until he became an earl. Robert Stewart grew up knowing that he had to be better than the English. He had to be more disciplined, more hardworking, and more dignified. He couldn't afford to be lazy. He adopted a persona of icy reserve as a shield. If he showed no emotion, no one could look down on him. He entered politics young, and he entered it in Ireland. The Ireland of the 1790s was a powder keg. The American Revolution had happened. The French Revolution was exploding across the Channel. The ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity were seeping into the Irish drinking halls. The people were groaning under British rule, and they were organizing. In 1798, the keg exploded. The United Irishmen Rebellion began. This was a vicious, bloody civil war. It wasn't a gentleman's war. It was fought with pikes and pitchforks in farmyards, and with muskets and cannons in the towns. It was neighbor against neighbor. Castlereagh was the chief secretary for Ireland. He was 29 years old. It was his job to stop it, and he did, with a ruthlessness that shocked even his colleagues. He unleashed the military. He authorized the use of martial law. The stories from that time are horrific. Suspected rebels were rounded up. They were flogged until their backs were raw meat. A torture method, known as pitch capping, became infamous. Pouring hot pitch onto a man's head, letting it cool and harden, and then ripping it off, taking the scalp and hair with it. Castlereagh didn't hold the pitch cap himself. He sat in his office in Dublin Castle signing the orders. But he knew what was happening. He argued that terror was necessary to restore order. He believed that if the rebellion succeeded, Ireland would become a satellite of revolutionary France, and Britain would be destroyed. He crushed the rebellion. 30,000 people died in a matter of months. But he didn't stop there. He decided that the only way to prevent this from happening again was to erase Ireland's independence entirely. He pushed for the Act of Union, dissolving the Irish Parliament and ruling Ireland directly from London. The Irish politicians didn't want to give up their power, so Castlereagh bought them. He spent months in a back room in Dublin, handing out bribes. He gave away peerages, titles, pensions, and hard cash. He looked men in the eye, men he despised, and promised them wealth if they would sell their country. He called it buying the fee simple of Irish corruption. He hated it. He wrote to his friends that he felt dirty. He felt like a pimp for the state, but he did it. The Act of Union passed in 1800. Ireland was joined to Britain. This was the making of the man. He learned that results mattered more than methods. He learned that to be a statesman, you had to be willing to dirty your hands up to the elbows. He learned to suppress his own conscience for the greater good. He left Ireland and went to London expecting to be hailed as a problem solver. Instead, he found that he had brought a ghost with him. To the Irish, he was a traitor. To the English radicals, he was a butcher. The nicknames started to follow him: Bloody Castlereagh. This was the baggage he carried into the 19th century. A reputation for coldness, a willingness to use violence, a belief that order was worth any price. But in London, he would face a different kind of war, not against rebels with pikes, but against a dictator with the greatest army Europe had ever seen. Napoleon Bonaparte was tearing up the world, and Castlereagh was about to step onto the biggest stage of all. London, 1809. The fog on Putney Heath was thick, clinging to the gorse and dampening the sounds of the waking city nearby. It was 6 o'clock in the morning on September 21st. 2 carriages arrived from opposite directions, their wheels crunching softly on the gravel. Out of them stepped 2 of the most powerful men in the British Empire. On one side stood George Canning, the Foreign Secretary. He was brilliant, witty, a master orator, and a man who believed himself destined to lead the nation. On the other stood Lord Castlereagh, the Secretary of State for War. He was tall, impassive, and radiating a cold, deadly fury. They were not there to debate policy. They were there to kill each other. This moment, 2 serving cabinet ministers facing off with pistols at 12 paces, is one of the most bizarre and illuminating incidents in British political history. It is the hidden story that reveals exactly who Robert Stewart was. and it lays the psychological groundwork for his eventual suicide 13 years later. To understand why he cut his throat in 1822, you must understand why he pulled the trigger in 1809. The road to Putney Heath began in the mud of the Netherlands and the back rooms of Westminster. By 1809, the war against Napoleon was going badly. Britain was the whale, dominant at sea, while France was the elephant, unbeatable on land. Napoleon controlled almost all of Europe. Britain was isolated, hemorrhaging money, and terrified of invasion. Castlereagh, as war minister, had conceived a bold plan to break the stalemate. He launched a massive amphibious invasion of the island of Walcheren, off the Dutch coast. The goal was to seize the port of Antwerp and destroy the French fleet. It was the D-Day of the 19th century. 40,000 soldiers and 600 ships. It was a catastrophe. The army didn't get defeated by the French. They got defeated by a microscopic killer. Walcheren fever, a mix of malaria, typhus, and dysentery, ravaged the troops. The commanders, chosen by political compromise rather than merit, dithered. The British army rotted in the swamps. Thousands died not in glorious battle, but shivering in their own filth. The expedition was a humiliating failure. In London, the knives came out, and the sharpest knife belonged to George Canning. Canning and Castlereagh were natural enemies. Canning was the flashy intellectual who mocked Castlereagh's tangled, boring speeches. Castlereagh was the workhorse who viewed Canning as a slippery intriguer. Unknown to Castlereagh, Canning had gone to the Prime Minister, the aging Duke of Portland, and issued an ultimatum: fire Castlereagh or I quit. The weak Prime Minister agreed, but was too afraid to tell Castlereagh to his face. For months, the entire cabinet knew that Castlereagh was a dead man walking. They sat in meetings with him, ate dinner with him, and discussed war strategy with him, all while knowing his career was already over. Canning, smiling across the table, was orchestrating his demise. When Castlereagh finally found out, not from the Prime Minister but through a leaked conversation, he didn't just get angry, he went cold. To a man like Castlereagh, this wasn't just politics. It was a violation of the fundamental code of a gentleman. It was cowardice. It was a stab in the back. In his mind, honor was a tangible asset, more valuable than life itself. If you lost your honor, you ceased to exist as a man of worth. He went to his desk and wrote a letter to Canning. It wasn't a resignation. It was a challenge. "You knew I was being deceived," he wrote, "and you continued to sit by my side as a colleague. This conduct is such as to require satisfaction." Satisfaction meant blood. So there they were on Putney Heath. The seconds loaded the pistols. The ground was measured. Canning had never fired a pistol in his life. Castlereagh was an expert marksman. They took their positions. The signal was given. Both men fired. Canning's shot went wide, whistling harmlessly past Castlereagh. But Castlereagh's aim was true. He didn't shoot to kill. If he had wanted to, Canning would have been dead. He shot to wound. The bullet tore through the flesh of Canning's thigh. Canning collapsed. Castlereagh, his honor satisfied the moment the blood appeared, immediately dropped his gun and rushed to help bind his rival's wound. It was a moment of supreme Regency absurdity, violence regulated by exquisite manners. Both men resigned in disgrace. The government collapsed. Castlereagh retreated to his country estate, his career seemingly in ruins. He was 40 years old, reviled for the Walcheren disaster, and mocked for the duel. But history has a strange sense of humor. The duel didn't end him. It purified him. It proved to the political establishment that while Castlereagh might be unpopular, he was a man of absolute terrifying integrity. He was dangerous, yes, but he was solid. And in a world rapidly falling apart, solidity was what Britain needed. He spent 3 years in the wilderness. Then in 1812, fate intervened again. The Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval, was assassinated, shot dead in the lobby of the House of Commons by a deranged merchant. It remains the only assassination of a British Prime Minister. In the chaos that followed, the new government under Lord Liverpool looked around for a man strong enough to take the hardest job in the world. They looked at the map of Europe, which was now almost entirely red with French dominance. They needed a foreign secretary who could stare down Napoleon. They called Castlereagh back. This is where the second and greatest act of his life began. The year 1812 is famous for Tchaikovsky's overture and the burning of Moscow, but for Castlereagh, it was the year of the grand strategy. When he walked into the Foreign Office, the situation was bleak. Napoleon had gathered the Grande Armée, 600,000 men, the largest military force ever assembled, to invade Russia. Most observers believed Russia would fall in weeks. If Russia fell, Britain would be truly alone, starved into submission by Napoleon's continental system. Castlereagh's strategy was simple but wildly ambitious. He would buy the war. He knew Britain couldn't field an army big enough to fight Napoleon alone. But Britain had the Industrial Revolution. It had the Bank of England. It had credit. Castlereagh opened the floodgates of British gold. He sent millions of pounds to Russia, to Prussia, to Sweden, to anyone who would pick up a musket against the French. He wasn't just a paymaster, he became the glue of the coalition. Coalitions are notoriously fragile. The Russians didn't trust the Austrians hated the Prussians. Everyone was suspicious of the British. Napoleon's greatest talent wasn't artillery, it was dividing his enemies. He would beat one, sign a separate peace, and then turn on the next. Castlereagh determined that this time they would fight as one. In the winter of 1813, he did something unprecedented for a British Foreign Secretary. He left London. He traveled to the continent, into the war zone. He felt he couldn't manage the egos of the czars and emperors by letter. He had to be there, in the room, looking them in the eye. The journey itself was a nightmare. Europe was freezing. The roads were churned into frozen ruts by the passage of armies. Castlereagh traveled through villages that had been burned to the ground, past fields littered with the frozen corpses of French and Russian soldiers. He arrived at the Allied headquarters in Basel, Switzerland, in January 1814. He found chaos. The Allies had won the Battle of Leipzig, but they were squabbling. The Austrian foreign minister, Prince Metternich, was terrified that if they crushed Napoleon too completely, Russia would become the new tyrant of Europe. The Russian Tsar, Alexander I, was filled with religious messianism and wanted to ride into Paris like a conquering god. Napoleon, though wounded, was still dangerous. He was fighting a brilliant defensive campaign in France, winning battles against the odds, betting that the Allies would turn on each other. Castlereagh sat them down. In the town of Chaumont, he pulled off his diplomatic masterpiece. He drafted the Treaty of Chaumont. It was a contract. It bound the four great powers, Britain, Russia, Austria, Prussia, into a tighter alliance than the world had ever seen. They agreed not to sign a separate peace with Napoleon. They agreed to keep 150,000 men in the field each. And Britain agreed to pay a staggering subsidy of £5 million to finance it all. He didn't use flowery language. He used the cold logic of survival. He told them, essentially, if we break apart now, he will hang us all separately. Take the money, sign the paper, and finish it. They signed. With the coalition solidified, the sheer weight of numbers crushed Napoleon. The Allies marched on Paris. On March 31st, 1814, the unthinkable happened. Russian Cossacks watered their horses in the Seine. Napoleon abdicated. The war that had consumed a generation was over. Castlereagh entered Paris not as a conqueror, but as a celebrity. The crowds cheered him. The sovereigns of Europe treated him as an equal. He wrote to his wife Emily, describing the surreal feeling of walking through the palaces where the monster had ruled just days before. But Castlereagh did not share the euphoria. While the rest of London and Paris were getting drunk on victory, he was already looking at the horizon. He saw the cracks. He saw that Russia was now effectively the master of the continent, with an army that dwarfed everyone else's. He saw that Prussia wanted vengeance. They wanted to strip France of territory, to humiliate her. He saw that France was a wounded animal that could easily turn rabid again if pushed too hard. He knew that winning the war was the easy part. Winning the peace would be the nightmare. He returned to London for a brief victory lap. The House of Commons rose to give him a standing ovation, the man they had hissed at a few years earlier. The Prince Regent invested him with the Order of the Garter. He was at the absolute zenith of his power, but he had no time to rest. The victors had agreed to meet in Vienna to decide the future of the world. It was to be the greatest diplomatic gathering in history. Castlereagh packed his bags again. He took his wife, his retinue of secretaries, and his silverware. He headed for Austria with a clear, cold vision. He didn't want a democratic Europe. He didn't want a just Europe in the modern sense. He wanted a stable Europe. He wanted a machine that would run without friction, balanced so perfectly that war became impossible. He was about to walk into a snake pit of spies, mistresses, emperors, and thieves. The Congress of Vienna awaited him, and it was there, amidst the ballrooms and the backstabbing, that he would forge his legacy and sow the seeds of the exhaustion that would eventually kill him. Vienna, September 1814. The Austrian capital had transformed into the center of the universe. Imagine a city where every hotel, every palace, and every grand house was bursting with the most famous people on earth. 2 emperors, 4 kings, 11 ruling princes, and thousands of diplomats, camp followers, spies, and social climbers had descended on the city. This was the Congress of Vienna. It was supposed to be a peace conference. It turned into the most expensive, glamorous, and dangerous party in history. The sheer scale of the excess was staggering. The Austrian emperor, the host, nearly bankrupted his state to keep the champagne flowing. There were masquerade balls that lasted until dawn, medieval jousting tournaments, sleigh rides on artificial snow, and banquets where whole oxen were roasted. The Prince de Ligne, an elderly observer of this madness, famously quipped, "Le Congrès ne marche pas, il danse." But while the music played, the knives were being sharpened in the back rooms. Castlereagh arrived in this glittering shark tank with a singular purpose. He was immune to the glamour. He didn't care about the mistresses or the medals. He brought with him his wife Emily, a choice that the continental diplomats found quaint and slightly boring. And he established a routine of punishing work. He would attend the balls, stand in the corner, looking impeccable and bored, listen to the gossip, and then return to his desk to write letters until 4 a.m. He was the only man in Vienna who knew exactly what he wanted. Everyone else was looking for a slice of territory. The Russians wanted Poland. The Prussians wanted Saxony. The Austrians wanted Italy. Castlereagh wanted balance. His main opponent was not a Frenchman, but his own ally, Tsar Alexander I of Russia. Alexander was the wild card of the Congress. He was handsome, charming, and deeply unstable. He believed he was God's chosen instrument to redeem Europe. He currently had 500,000 Russian troops occupying Poland, and his attitude was simple: I am here and I am not leaving. He planned to annex the entirety of Poland and install his puppet on the throne. To support this, he made a deal with Prussia. You let me take Poland, and I'll let you swallow the kingdom of Saxony. This was the nightmare scenario for Castlereagh. If the deal went through, Russia would dominate Eastern Europe, and Prussia would dominate Central Europe. Austria would be crushed between them, and the balance of power would be destroyed. It would just be a new tyranny, trading Napoleon for the Tsar. The tension rose throughout the winter of 1814. The Peace Congress was on the verge of starting a new world war. The climax came in January 1815. The arguments in the conference rooms had turned into shouting matches. The Tsar, in a fit of rage, threatened to march his armies all the way to Vienna. He challenged Prince Metternich to a duel. The drums of war were actually beating again. Austrian and British generals were dusting off their campaign plans to fight the Russians. This was Castlereagh's moment. He did something so cold, so pragmatic, and so risky that it remains a masterclass in realpolitik. He went to the representative of France. France was the defeated enemy. Its representative was Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, a man so slippery he had served the church, the revolution, Napoleon, and the king, betraying each of them in turn to survive. He was known as the Lame Devil. The other powers had shut him out of the main negotiations. Castlereagh brought him back in. On the night of January 3rd, 1815, in total secrecy, Castlereagh sat down with Metternich of Austria and Talleyrand of France. In a quiet room, lit by flickering candles, the British Foreign Secretary signed a secret military alliance with his recent enemy France, against his current allies, Russia and Prussia. The treaty stated that if Russia or Prussia attacked, Britain, France, and Austria would field 150,000 men each to stop them. It was a breathtaking gamble. If the British public had known that Castlereagh was pledging British soldiers to fight alongside the French just months after Waterloo, the government would have collapsed. He was risking his life and his career on a bluff. But the bluff worked. When rumors of the secret treaty were leaked to the Tsar, likely by Talleyrand, the bully backed down. Alexander realized he couldn't fight a united Western Europe. He agreed to a compromise. Poland was partitioned, Saxony was saved, and the balance of power was preserved. Castlereagh had won. He had stopped a war without firing a shot simply by the weight of his resolve. But history wasn't done with him yet. On the morning of March 7, 1815, a courier burst into Metternich's bedroom with a sealed envelope marked urgent. Metternich opened it, read it, and went pale. Napoleon had escaped. The emperor had slipped away from his exile on the island of Elba. He had landed in France with a handful of guards. The French army sent to arrest him had instead fallen to their knees and cried, "Vive l'Empereur!" He was marching on Paris. The king had fled. The Congress of Vienna dissolved in panic. The dancing stopped. The diplomats looked at each other in horror. The monster was loose. In this moment of chaos, Castlereagh was the rock. While others dithered, he immediately declared that the coalition was reborn. He committed Britain to war instantly. He arranged for the Duke of Wellington to take command of the Allied forces in Belgium. He began the familiar work of raising millions of pounds in subsidies to pay for the armies of Europe. He did not stay for the battle. His work in Vienna was done. He returned to London to defend the government's policy in Parliament, leaving the fighting to Wellington. 3 months later, the news of Waterloo arrived in London. It was the definitive end. Napoleon was finished, this time exiled to the desolate rock of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, from where he would never return. The resulting peace treaty, the Second Treaty of Paris, was Castlereagh's final diplomatic masterpiece, and it is here that we see the modernity of his mind. The Prussians wanted blood. They wanted to execute Napoleon. They wanted to blow up a bridge in Paris named after a French victory. They wanted to carve off huge chunks of French territory and demand reparations. that would enslave France for a century. They wanted vengeance. Castlereagh said no. He argued that if they humiliated France too deeply, they would only guarantee another war in 20 years. He insisted on a moderate peace. France was pushed back to her 1790 borders, but she was left intact. She was not dismembered. She was allowed to remain a great power. He wrote to the Prime Minister, "It is not our business to collect trophies, but to bring back the world to peaceful habits." It was a profound insight. He understood that a stable peace requires the defeated enemy to be reintegrated, not crushed. It was a lesson the world would forget in 1919 at Versailles, with disastrous consequences. But in 1815, Castlereagh's wisdom prevailed. Europe entered an age of peace. The Congress system, regular meetings of the great powers to solve disputes, became the forerunner of the United Nations. Castlereagh was, effectively, the President of Europe. He returned to England in the summer of 1815 as a colossus. He had achieved everything he set out to do. The French threat was gone. The Russian threat was contained. The empire was secure. But as his ship docked at Dover and he looked out at the white cliffs of the country he had saved, he was not returning to a grateful nation. He was returning to a country that was breaking apart. The war had acted as a bandage, holding British society together through the shared fear of invasion. Now that the bandage was ripped off, the wound was exposed. The economy crashed. The government ceased buying uniforms and weapons, bankrupting factories. 300,000 soldiers and sailors were discharged into an economy with no jobs. The price of bread skyrocketed because of the Corn Laws, laws that Castlereagh supported to protect the profits of landowners. Starvation stalked the industrial cities, and with starvation came rage. The people didn't want foreign treaties. They wanted reform. They wanted the vote. They wanted food. Castlereagh, the man who had just spent years negotiating with emperors, had no patience for this. He viewed the radical reformers not as suffering citizens, but as a domestic version of the French Jacobins, anarchists who would tear down the Constitution and set up a guillotine in Piccadilly Circus. He had saved Europe by being cold, rigid, and unyielding. Now he would apply those same tactics to the people of Manchester and London. The tragedy of the second half of his life was about to begin. The diplomat was about to become the enforcer. And as the hatred of the crowds grew louder and the stress of holding the lid on the boiling pot of England intensified, the cracks in the marble man began to widen. He was about to enter the darkest years of the Regency, where the savior of Europe would slowly transform into the mask of anarchy. London, 1819? The air in the capital tasted of coal smoke and suppressed rage. The euphoria of defeating Napoleon had evaporated years ago, replaced by a grim, grinding misery that hung over the British Isles like the eternal gray fog. For Robert Stewart, Lord Castlereagh, the transition from the ballrooms of Vienna to the floor of the House of Commons was a descent into hell. He had spent years debating the fate of nations with emperors. Now he spent his nights being screamed at by radicals, defending a government that the people had come to loathe. To understand the tragedy of his final years, you must understand the state of Britain in the post-war era. It was a dystopian nightmare. The end of the war had brought not prosperity, but economic collapse. The government stopped buying cannons, uniforms, and ships, and the iron foundries and textile mills went silent. 300,000 soldiers and sailors returned home to find no jobs, their bodies broken by service, begging on the street corners. Then nature itself turned against them. 1816 was known as the year without a summer. A volcanic eruption in Indonesia threw so much ash into the atmosphere that it blotted out the sun across the globe. In England, it snowed in June. Crops rotted in the fields. The price of bread, already artificially inflated by the Corn Laws to protect the rich, became a death sentence for the poor. Starvation stalked the industrial North, and where there is starvation, there is sedition. Huge crowds began to gather in Manchester, Birmingham, and London, demanding reform. They wanted the vote. They wanted a parliament that represented the people, not just the landowners. They wore the red caps of liberty, echoing the terrifying imagery of the French Revolution. Castlereagh looked at these starving crowds, and he didn't see citizens asking for help. He saw 1789. He saw the guillotine. He saw the chaos he had spent his entire life fighting. In his mind, there was no middle ground. You either had order, maintained by the sword if necessary, or you had anarchy. He became the face of the Iron Hand. As leader of the House of Commons, it was his job to stand at the dispatch box night after night and justify the government's repression. He suspended habeas corpus, the ancient right that prevented imprisonment without trial. He empowered magistrates to ban public meetings, but his most controversial weapon was the spy network. The Home Office employed a shadowy army of informers, men like the infamous Oliver the Spy. These agents didn't just report on radical plots, they actively manufactured them. They would infiltrate groups of desperate, hungry weavers, talk them into planning a rebellion, and then hand them over to the hangman. When the opposition in Parliament roared that this was un-British, that it was a system of entrapment, Castlereagh stood up cold and unmoved. He argued that the safety of the state justified any method. He refused to apologize. To him, these spies were a necessary evil to prevent a second French Revolution on English soil. But the event that would irrevocably brand him as a monster, the event that would haunt him until his suicide, happened on a hot August day in 1819. St. Peter's Fields, Manchester, August 16th. 60,000 people had gathered. It was the largest political meeting in British history. They were there to hear Henry Hunt, a radical orator, speak about parliamentary reform. It was a peaceful crowd. Men had brought their wives and children. They wore their Sunday best. They carried banners that said "Vote for All" and "Love." The local magistrates, watching from a window overlooking the field, panicked. They saw the sheer size of the crowd and assumed a riot was inevitable. They read the Riot Act, though hardly anyone could hear it, and then ordered the arrest of the speakers. To execute the arrest, they sent in the Manchester and Salford yeomanry. The yeomanry were not professional soldiers. They were local shopkeepers, publicans, and landowners mounted on horses, armed with sabers. Many of them were drunk, and many of them had personal scores to settle with the protesters in the crowd. They charged. It was a slaughter. The yeomanry hacked their way through the dense crowd to get to the speaker's wagon. They slashed at men, women, and children indiscriminately. The panic was absolute. People were trampled under hooves, crushed against walls, and cut down by sabers. 15 people died. Over 600 were injured. A 2-year-old child was knocked from his mother's arms and trampled to death. A veteran of Waterloo, who had survived the charge of the French cavalry, was cut down by his own countrymen. A journalist named James Rowe, witnessing the carnage, dubbed it Peterloo, a bitter mocking portmanteau of St. Peter's Fields and Waterloo. The name stuck. It stripped the government of its military glory and replaced it with the shame of massacring unarmed civilians. When the news reached London, the nation held its breath. Surely the government would condemn the magistrates? Surely someone would be held accountable? Castlereagh and the cabinet did the opposite. They sent a letter to the magistrates congratulating them on their prompt and effective action in preserving the public peace. In the House of Commons, Castlereagh defended the massacre with chilling legalism. He blamed the protesters. He argued that the size of the crowd constituted a threat in itself. He claimed the soldiers had acted in self-defense. He did not show a flicker of sympathy for the dead child or the maimed women. This was the moment the public hatred for him calcified into something permanent and deadly. He was no longer just a reactionary politician. He was a vampire. Percy Bysshe Shelley, living in Italy, read the accounts of the massacre and wrote The Mask of Anarchy, the greatest political poem in the English language. He gave the face of murder the face of the Foreign Secretary. I met murder on the way. He had a mask like Castlereagh. Very smooth he looked, yet grim. 7 bloodhounds followed him. Castlereagh had become a symbol of pure evil to the working class. He received death threats daily. He carried pistols in his coat pockets. He slept with them under his pillow. And the threats were not empty. In 1820, the shadow war between the government and the radicals reached its terrifying climax with the Cato Street Conspiracy. This was not a manufactured plot by spies. This was real. A group of hardcore revolutionaries, led by a man named Arthur Thistlewood, had decided that peaceful reform was impossible. They hatched a plan that was breathtaking in its violence. They discovered that the entire cabinet, Castlereagh, the Prime Minister Lord Liverpool, the Duke of Wellington, and all the others, were scheduled to have a private dinner at the home of Lord Harrowby in Grosvenor Square. The plan was simple. They would knock on the door carrying a frantic message. Once the door was opened, they would rush in with grenades and swords. They would slaughter everyone in the room. They brought bags with them to carry away the severed heads of Castlereagh and Sidmouth. They planned to spike the heads on Westminster Bridge and declare a provisional government. Castlereagh, of course, knew all about it. His spy network had infiltrated the group. He knew the date, the time, and the weapons. Most men would have arrested the plotters immediately. Castlereagh did not. He advised his colleagues to let the plot ripen. He wanted them to get as close to the door as possible, armed and ready, so that there could be no doubt of their intent in court. It was a cold-blooded gamble with his own life and the lives of his friends. On the night of the dinner, the cabinet minister stayed home. Instead, a team of Bow Street runners and Coldstream guards raided the plotters' hideout in a loft on Cato Street. A vicious firefight broke out in the dark, hay-filled loft. One police officer was run through with a sword and killed. The plotters were dragged out in irons. The trial was a sensation. Thistlewood and 4 others were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the medieval punishment for treason. In the end, they were merely hanged and then beheaded. The crowd that gathered outside Newgate Prison to watch the executions was vast. But when the executioner held up the severed head of Arthur Thistlewood and shouted, "Behold the head of a traitor," the crowd did not cheer. They hissed. They groaned. Castlereagh watched all of this with his usual impassive mask, but the strain was beginning to show. He was now 51. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts: the diplomatic war to keep Europe stable, and the domestic war to keep Britain from exploding. And just when he thought he had weathered the storm, the monarchy itself threw a grenade into the room. King George III died in 1820. The Prince Regent finally became King George IV, but there was a problem: his wife. Caroline of Brunswick was the new Queen of England. She and George hated each other with a toxicity that makes modern royal scandals look like fairy tales. They had separated in 1796. George had banned her from court and cut her off from their daughter. She had gone into exile in Europe, traveling around Italy with a suspected lover, an Italian commoner named Bartolomeo Pergami. When George became king, He was determined to divorce her. He wanted her stripped of her title and barred from the coronation. Caroline, however, was not a woman to go quietly. She returned to England to claim her rights. The public went wild. They hated the king. He was fat, extravagant, and cruel. They saw Caroline as the wronged woman, a victim of the same tyrannical establishment that had given them Peterloo. The Queen became a figurehead for the radical movement. God Save the Queen became a revolutionary slogan. Castlereagh was caught in the middle. As leader of the house, it was his duty to manage the king's great matter. He had to introduce the Bill of Pains and Penalties to Parliament, a bill designed to strip Caroline of her title on the grounds of adultery. To do this, he had to carry the famous green bag into the House of Commons. The bag contained the gathered evidence of the Queen's sexual escapades in Italy, testimonies from chambermaids and spies about who slept in which bed. It was sleazy, it was humiliating, and it made Castlereagh the target of a fury that eclipsed even Peterloo. Mobs surrounded his house in St. James's Square. They smashed the windows. They erected a gallows outside his front door. He had to be smuggled into Parliament. When he walked through the streets, he was spat upon. Inside the house, the debates were vicious. Castlereagh had to stand for hours, enduring attacks on his character, defending a king he privately thought was a disaster, against a queen who was being cheered by millions. The trial of the Queen in the House of Lords was a circus. In the end, the government technically won the vote, but the margin was so slim that they knew they could never pass the bill in the Commons. They had to drop it. The Queen had won. Government was humiliated. By 1821, the cumulative weight of these years was crushing him. Physically, he was falling apart. He suffered from terrible gout, which swelled his feet and made every step agony. He was aging rapidly, his hair turning white, his face gaunt. The marble features were becoming skeletal. Mentally, the isolation was absolute. He had no peers. His only real friend, the Duke of Wellington, was often away. His wife, Emily, was his rock. But even she could not share the burden of the state secrets he carried. He was working 18-hour days. He was handling the Foreign Office, managing the relationship with the unpredictable European powers, and simultaneously managing the House of Commons, fighting off the radicals and the reformers. He was doing the work of three men. He began to exhibit signs of what we would now call clinical burnout, compounded by paranoia. He became obsessed with the idea that he was misunderstood, that his sacrifices were invisible, and the world was changing around him. A new generation of politicians was rising, men like Robert Peel, who spoke of reform, of softening the laws, of moving away from the iron hand. Castlereagh felt like a relic. He was the man of 1815, the man of the old order, trying to hold back the tide of the 19th century. In late 1821, the king decided to go on a grand tour of his kingdoms to Ireland and Scotland. He took most of the court with him. Castlereagh was left in London to run the government. The silence of the summer of 1822 approached. The great crowds of the Queen's trial had dispersed, but the silence was almost worse. It left Castlereagh alone with his thoughts. And in the shadows of London, the blackmailers were watching. They saw a man who was exhausted, a man whose popularity was non-existent, a man who had lost the protective shell of invincibility. They saw prey. The trap was set. The hidden story of his final psychological destruction was about to begin. The political battles were over. The personal nightmare was starting. London, spring 1822. The season began with a deceptive calm. The great storms of war and riot had passed, and on the surface, Lord Castlereagh appeared to be the unassailable master of the British government. He was preparing for yet another diplomatic triumph, the upcoming Congress of Verona, where he planned to once again steer the powers of Europe away from conflict. But underneath the velvet coat and the Star of the Garter, the man was hollowed out. He was 53, but he looked 70. Decades of overwork, of nights spent writing dispatches by candlelight, and days spent standing on the hard floor of the House of Commons, had ravaged him. He was suffering from what his contemporaries called overexcitation of the mind. Today we would recognize the symptoms of severe clinical depression and paranoid psychosis. He complained of a confused sensation in his head. He told his wife, Emily, that his mind was going. But in the rigid culture of the Regency aristocracy, there was no mechanism for a man of his station to stop. He was the atlas of the state. If he shrugged, the sky would fall. So he forced himself to continue moving through the social calendar like a ghost. Then in July, the sky fell anyway. The event that triggered Castlereagh's final destruction did not happen in a chancellery or a battlefield. It happened in the sordid back room of a public house called the White Lion in the St. James's district of London. On the night of July 19, 1822, the nightmare scenario became reality. As mentioned, Percy Jocelyn, the Bishop of Clogher, was caught in the act with a private soldier at the White Lion. The details that emerged were catastrophic. The bishop was not just arrested, he was dragged into the street and beaten by a furious mob before fleeing the country in disgrace. For Castlereagh, this was not just news, it was a mirror showing his own potential fate. For Castlereagh, this news was not just a scandal, it was a psychological death sentence. The parallels were too terrifying to ignore. Like Castlereagh, the bishop was an Irish aristocrat from a powerful family. Like Castlereagh, he was a pillar of the establishment, a man of high rank and moral authority. And in the blink of an eye, he had been reduced to nothing. The Bishop of Clogher affair became the talk of London. The press, usually restrained by libel laws, went feral. Cartoons appeared depicting the bishop in grotesque situations. The public revulsion was absolute. The bishop was released on bail and immediately fled the country in disguise, disappearing into a life of shameful anonymity in Scotland. The lesson burned itself into Castlereagh's exhausted mind. Immunity is a myth. If a bishop could be destroyed, anyone could be. The protective wall of rank that had shielded the aristocracy for centuries had been breached. The mob was hungry for blood and the press was their weapon. It was in this atmosphere of heightened hysteria that the shadows began to close in on Castlereagh himself. We enter now into the hidden story, the part of the narrative that was scrubbed from the official biographies for 100 years. In the weeks following the bishop's arrest, Castlereagh began to receive anonymous letters. They were the classic tools of the London extortioners. They hinted at knowledge. They mentioned specific dates and times. They spoke of the same crime as the bishop. The prevailing theory, supported by the whisperings of his close friends after his death, is that Castlereagh had been entrapped. The story goes that he had been walking home late one night, perhaps seeking the anonymous comfort that many men of his class sought in the foggy streets. He was lured into a house, some say by a young man dressed as a woman, others say by a young man he met in a park. At the critical moment, the door burst open. The witnesses appeared. They didn't arrest him, they let him go. But the threat hung over him like a guillotine blade. We know who you are, we know what you did, and we will tell the world. Whether this entrapment physically happened, or whether it was a delusion born of his own guilt and fear of his repressed desires, is almost irrelevant. To Castlereagh, it was real. He believed he was being hunted by a gang who intended to expose him as a sodomite, a label that, in 1822, meant the end of his life as he knew it. By early August, the Marble Man had shattered. His behavior in Parliament became erratic. He sat on the front bench, staring into space with a wild, frightened look in his eyes. He whispered to colleagues that he was being watched. He began to invite people to his house for dinner and then forget they were there, sitting in silence while they ate. On August 9th, the final unraveling began. He went to the Foreign Office to pack his papers for the upcoming Congress of Verona, but he couldn't focus. He picked up documents and put them down again. He looked at his secretaries with suspicion. He told one of them, "My mind is gone. I am quite broken." He then drove to Carlton House for his weekly audience with King George IV. The meeting was one of the most harrowing scenes in British royal history. Castlereagh, usually the epitome of calm, courtly grace, burst into the king's presence. He was disheveled. He was trembling. He grabbed the king's arm, a breach of protocol that was unthinkable. "Sir," he cried, "it is all over. The police are looking for me. I am a fugitive." The king, bewildered, asked what he meant. "I am accused of the same crime as the Bishop of Cloghar," Castlereagh shouted. He began to rant about a conspiracy, about men watching his house, about his horses being poised for flight. He claimed that he had been sent mysterious packets of documents that proved his guilt. The king, who had known Castlereagh for decades and loved him like a brother, was horrified. He saw that his friend was in the grip of a total psychotic break. "Hunt," the king said, "you have not taken leave of your senses, have you?" Castlereagh began to weep. The king wept with him. They sat there, the monarch and his greatest minister, crying together in the opulent drawing room. The king finally composed himself and urged Castlereagh to see a doctor immediately. "You are very ill," he said. "Go home and rest." Castlereagh left the palace, but the terror did not leave him. He went to see his friend, the Duke of Wellington. Wellington was a man of iron, not given to emotion, but he was deeply alarmed by Castlereagh's appearance. Castlereagh paced around Wellington's room, repeating the same terrifying mantra. "I am mad. I know I am mad." He told Wellington that he was being blackmailed, that he was about to be arrested, that his life was over. Wellington, with his usual blunt pragmatism, told him, "I am bound to warn you that you cannot be in your right mind." Wellington immediately sent word to Castlereagh's personal physician, Dr. Bankhead. "Watch him," the Duke warned. "He is dangerous to himself." That evening, Friday, August 9th, Castlereagh was taken to his country estate, North Cray Place in Kent. The journey was a nightmare. He made his wife and the doctor sit in silence. He stared out the carriage window, convinced that every rider on the road was a police officer coming to arrest him. He thought he saw conspirators in the shadows of the trees. When they arrived at the beautiful, tranquil estate, the trap closed. Dr. Bankhead and Emily Stewart took drastic measures. They recognized the signs of suicide. They scoured his dressing room and bedroom. They removed his straight razors. They took away his pistols. They emptied his pockets. They thought they had sanitized the environment. Saturday and Sunday were days of agonizing tension. Castlereagh was subjected to cupping, a medical treatment where hot glass cups were placed on the temples to draw blood, in the belief that it would relieve the pressure on the brain. It only weakened him further. He spent the days wandering the house, a ghost in his own life. He spoke to his wife in heartbreaking terms, asking if she too despised him. He asked Dr. Bankhead if the news from London had arrived yet, meaning the warrant for his arrest. On Sunday night, he sat down to write a letter to the king. He scribbled furiously for half an hour. When he finished, he looked at the paper. It was a jumble of illegible scratches. His mind could no longer form words. He tore it up. He went to bed. Emily, terrified to leave him alone, had ordered his bed moved into her room. She watched him sleep, or pretend to sleep, through the long, hot night. Monday morning, August 12th, 1822. Castlereagh woke early. He told the doctor he felt better. He asked to go to his dressing room to wash. Dr. Bankhead, exhausted and perhaps lulled by the calmness of his patient's voice, agreed but waited in the adjoining room. Castlereagh walked into the dressing room. He went to his pocketbook, which was lying on a bureau. The servants had missed it. Inside, tucked away in a small fold of leather, was the tiny penknife. He didn't hesitate. He didn't write a note. The terror of the unspeakable crime was so absolute that death was the only door left open. He made the cut. And with that single stroke, the Regency era, with all its glory, its cruelty, and its secrets, came to a bloody end. The funeral of Viscount Castlereagh was the final battle of his life. The government, terrified of the scandal that would erupt if the true reason for his suicide became known, rushed to control the narrative. The coroner, a man named Joseph Cartar, was leaned on heavily. The verdict of temporary insanity was legally dubious but politically necessary. It allowed Castlereagh to be buried in consecrated ground rather than at a crossroads with a stake through his heart, as was the custom for suicides. On August 20th, 1822, his body was carried into Westminster Abbey. The great west door opened. The coffin, draped in black velvet, moved into the cool darkness of the cathedral. Inside, the peers of the realm stood in silence. They were burying one of their own, closing ranks around the memory of the man who had saved their world from Napoleon. But as the doors closed, the sound from outside could not be shut out. The mob was still there, and they were still cheering. It was a sound that haunted the British establishment for years. It was the sound of a country so divided, so broken by inequality, that the death of its greatest statesman was a cause for carnival. In the years that followed, a strange silence descended over Castlereagh's memory. His political rival, George Canning, took over the Foreign Office and took credit for the prosperous peace that followed. The Victorians, who arrived a generation later with their strict morality, found Castlereagh embarrassing. They didn't want to talk about the Bishop of Clogher. They didn't want to talk about blackmail. They scrubbed the story clean. Castlereagh became a dry, boring figure in history books, the man who drew lines on maps. But the truth is far more human and far more tragic. Castlereagh was not a monster, nor was he a saint. He was a man of immense capability who was crushed by the very system he tried to uphold. He spent his life building a balance of power for Europe, but he could not find a balance within himself. He lived in an age that demanded men be made of iron, yet he was destroyed by the fragility of his own nature. He was a victim of a society that weaponized shame. Today, if you visit Westminster Abbey, you can find his grave. It is near the monument to his mentor, William Pitt. It is a quiet spot. The jeers of the crowd have long since faded. The blackmailers are dust. The unspeakable crime is no longer a crime. But his story remains a warning. It is a reminder that power, no matter how vast, is no shield against fear. It is a reminder that the great men of history were not statues, but flesh and blood, men who could conquer continents yet still be broken by the secrets they carried in the dark. In the end, Robert Stuart, the man who defeated Napoleon, could not defeat the silence of his own dressing room. He remains the icy Viscount, the statesman of the world, and the tragic casualty of a time that had no mercy for the human heart.